I had my husband at that time had gotten letters of introduction from the head of a theater chain. Those were the days when theater chains were very important, and they extended courtesies of this sort. Unless you get a series in today's television medium, why, very difficult. So I'm pretty lucky.
Fans spent 9 seasons watching her play the same kind of woman. Sharp, unmarried, devoted to her job instead of a husband, and never once questioned why. Then, 2 years before she died, a writer asked Nancy Kulp a single direct question about her personal life. She didn't answer yes, she didn't answer no. Instead, she gave him a riddle, one so carefully worded that people are still picking it apart decades later. What she actually said that day, and why she insisted on controlling every word of it, tells you more about Hollywood in the 20th century than almost anything she ever did on screen. The riddle she gave instead of a yes or no. In 1989, author Bose Hadley sat down with Nancy Kulp for a book he was writing about closeted actresses in Hollywood. He had one question he needed to ask, the same one he'd been asking every woman in the book, whether she was gay. Kulp didn't dodge the question. She did something stranger. She told him that if he printed her answer exactly as she gave it, word for word, alongside the exact question, he could use it. Then she asked to rephrase the question herself before answering it. Instead of asking whether she was a lesbian, she suggested he ask whether she believed opposites attract. Her answer was that she didn't believe that at all, that she was the kind of person who believed birds of a feather flock together, and she considered that answer sufficient. She never once used the word lesbian in the entire conversation. She didn't have to. Hadley's book, titled Hollywood Lesbians, featured a whole roster of actresses from the same era, most of whom had spent entire careers avoiding this exact conversation with journalists, and Kulp's chapter stood out because she was one of the few subjects who agreed to engage with the question at all, rather than declining to participate. Hadley included the exchange in his book, and it's been quoted, dissected, and argued over ever since, resurfacing repeatedly in later decades whenever LGBTQ publications compiled lists of early coded acknowledgments from mainstream actresses of her generation. Some longtime fans read it and felt like a puzzle they'd wondered about for 30 years had finally clicked into place. Others still argue she never actually confirmed anything at all, that she simply answered a clever question with an equally clever non-answer. What almost nobody disputes is that she chose her words with the precision of someone who had been protecting this exact information for most of her adult life. And that raises an obvious question. If she'd spent decades this careful, why give any answer at all, even a coded one, this late in her career? The war record. Nobody expected from a comic actress. Long before Hollywood knew her name, Nancy Kulp was already the kind of person people took seriously. Born in 1921 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and raised nearby in the small town of Mifflintown, she was the daughter of a lawyer and a schoolteacher, a household that valued achievement over almost anything else. She earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from Florida State University, then went on to get a master's degree in English and French from the University of Miami, credentials most working actresses of her era simply didn't have. During World War II, she served in the Naval Reserve, part of the same generation of women who took on military and administrative work while the men in their lives were deployed overseas. And she received several commendations for that service before the war ended. After the war, she didn't head straight for a soundstage. She took a job as a Hollywood publicist instead, the kind of behind-the-scenes career that suited her serious, buttoned-up personality far better than the spotlight ever seemed to. It was there that she caught the attention of director George Cukor, a man known throughout the industry for discovering overlooked talent. And within a few weeks of that introduction, her acting career actually began. Cukor himself was quietly gay in an industry that would have destroyed his career if that fact ever became public. And he built much of his social and professional circle around other people in Hollywood who understood exactly what that kind of secrecy required. Years later, that same circle would connect Kulp professionally to actor Rock Hudson, another closeted star of the era, when the two appeared together in the film Strange Bedfellows, a small but telling sign of just how tightly woven that particular corner of Hollywood really was. Kulp moved through those circles for years before anyone outside them had any idea what any of it meant. That single connection, one publicist getting noticed by the right director, is the reason Nancy Kulp ended up in front of a camera at all instead of staying behind one for the rest of her career. The role she kept playing on, screen and off. Once Kulp started acting, Hollywood figured out almost immediately what to do with her, and it never really changed. She appeared in respected films like Shane and the Three Faces of Eve, then landed a role in The Parent Trap, but it was television that made her a household name. In 1962, she was cast as Miss Jane Hathaway, the fiercely competent, endlessly patient secretary on the Beverly Hillbillies, and the role earned her multiple Emmy nominations over the course of the show's run. Audiences loved her instantly, but look closely at the character Hollywood kept handing her over and over, across an entire career. Prim, unmarried, devoted entirely to her career instead of a husband, described by nearly everyone around her as awkward with men, more comfortable with paperwork than romance. It was practically the only type of role she ever played, film after film, decade after decade, and almost nobody at the time stopped to ask why a studio system fixated on marrying off every other leading lady kept casting this one specific actress as the woman who never would be. There's an odd postscript to that typecasting, too. When the Beverly Hillbillies was remade as a feature film decades later, the role of Miss Jane Hathaway went to actress Lily Tomlin, who is herself gay, a casting choice almost nobody at the studio seemed to treat as significant at the time, even though it meant the character had now been played twice by women quietly living the exact same reality the role always seemed to hint at. Kulp herself never publicly connected the dots between her own life and the characters she was hired to play, at least not until that one interview years later. But watch the show again, knowing what came out afterward, and Miss Jane Hathaway starts looking less like a coincidence and more like the industry accidentally typecasting a woman as exactly who she already was, without ever actually saying so out loud. That pattern held for years, right up until Kulp's own personal life gave people their first real reason to wonder if there was more to the story. The marriage that lasted exactly 10 years. You see, in 1951, Kulp married Charles Malcolm Dacus, a graduate of Birmingham Southern College and the son of a man named John Reed II, in a small, proper ceremony with friends standing as her maid of honor and best man, and a modest guest list that included a handful of close acquaintances rather than any Hollywood names. It was Dacus, by Kulp's own account, who first encouraged her to pursue acting seriously rather than staying behind the scenes as a publicist, although she later credited George Cukor with the same push in other interviews, giving two slightly different origin stories for the same career decision, depending on who was asking her and when. That inconsistency itself is notable, since Kulp was otherwise known throughout her career as a precise, deliberate speaker who rarely misremembered details about her own history. The marriage lasted exactly 10 years, ending in divorce in 1961, right around the same period her acting career was picking up real momentum. She never remarried, not once, not for the remaining 30 years of her life, despite becoming one of the most recognizable faces on American television within just a year of that divorce being finalized. For most actresses of her generation, a single failed marriage followed by decades of staying single would have generated exactly the kind of quiet Hollywood gossip that never quite gets printed in any magazine. And for Kulp, it did. Friends and colleagues noticed. Fans wrote letters asking why Miss Jane Hathaway's real-life counterpart never seemed to date anyone publicly. Kulp gave interviews about her career for decades and consistently steered every conversation away from her personal life whenever reporters tried to press further. That kind of consistent, practiced deflection doesn't happen by accident, and it's exactly the kind of pattern that, looking back, makes her carefully worded answer years later feel less like a surprise and more like the last piece finally being set down. But her divorce wasn't the only relationship from this era that ended badly. One other relationship, a professional one, would blow up publicly, years after the cameras stopped rolling. The betrayal that ended a friendship for good. After the Beverly Hillbillies ended in 1971, Kulp didn't disappear from public life. She kept working steadily, appearing in shows like Sanford and Son and Fantasy Island, and eventually moved back to Pennsylvania, where she set her sights on something far more ambitious than acting. In 1984, she ran as the Democratic candidate for a seat in the United States House of Representatives, challenging Republican incumbent Bud Shuster in a district that leaned heavily conservative. She was already the underdog. Then, her own former co-star made things dramatically worse. Buddy Ebsen, who had played Jed Clampett across from her for 9 full seasons and had since gone on to star as the title character in the detective series Barnaby Jones, recorded a radio advertisement for her opponent, publicly labeling Kulp too liberal for the district and questioning whether she was using her old sitcom fame to prop up the campaign. Ebsen had no personal ties to Pennsylvania whatsoever. He'd never lived there, campaigned there, or had any real stake in the outcome beyond his own political leanings, which made the ad feel especially personal to Kulp. Both actors had served in the Navy decades earlier, a shared background that had never stopped their political arguments on set, and clearly didn't stop this one either, since the two had reportedly clashed over politics for years during filming, disagreements the cast and crew had simply learned to treat as routine. She lost the race badly, drawing roughly 59,000 votes to Schuster's over 117,000, a lopsided defeat made worse by exactly whose voice had helped cause it. She said afterward that she was stunned by the betrayal, calling it needless and cruel in interviews given shortly after the defeat, and she made a point of noting publicly that she would never have done something like that to him, regardless of how strongly they disagreed politically. For years afterward, the two former co-stars reportedly didn't speak at all outside of occasional press appearances tied to Beverly Hillbillies reunions. By his own final years, Ebsen had reportedly come to regret recording that ad in the first place, a quiet admission that came long after the damage to Kulp's political career was already permanent. Some later accounts suggest the two eventually made peace before Kulp's death, though the record on that point remains mixed, depending on which interview you read. Either way, it's a strange footnote to a show remembered mostly for its warmth, and it proves that whatever was actually going on in Kulp's private life, it wasn't the only tension quietly sitting behind that famous sitcom smile. The question she renamed before she'd answer it. By the time Bose Hadley sat down across from her in 1989, Kulp was 67 years old and had spent an entire career being asked, in one indirect way or another, why she'd never remarried. She'd deflected variations of that question for roughly 3 decades. What made this particular interview different wasn't just her carefully phrased non-denial. It was everything she said around it. Hadley had reportedly nicknamed the sexuality question his fatal question, since it had effectively ended several other actresses' careers or reputations whenever it was asked too directly. His book set out to interview a whole roster of actresses from Kulp's era about this exact subject, and notably, several approached for the project simply declined to participate at all, rather than risk any part of the conversation becoming public, which makes Kulp's decision to engage with the question, however carefully worded her answer turned out to be, stand out from most of her peers. Kulp seemed to understand exactly what was at stake in how she answered it, which is likely why she insisted on controlling the exact wording before agreeing to respond at all. That same year, in a detail almost nobody connects to the interview, Kulp appeared as the very first guest ever booked on the Arsenio Hall show, a mainstream late-night program reaching a far larger and more casual audience than any book about closeted Hollywood actresses ever would, meaning she was actively managing 2 very different public images simultaneously, the safe television guest and the woman quietly answering a far riskier question elsewhere that same year. It's worth noting that 1989 also happened to be 5 years after her congressional defeat, meaning by the time this interview took place, she had already lost the one career path where public exposure of her private life would have carried the highest possible political cost, which may partly explain why she was willing to engage with the question at all by that point. Elsewhere in that same book conversation, she spoke admiringly of Barney Frank, one of the first openly gay members of Congress. And when Hadley asked whether she herself would have come out publicly had she actually won her own congressional race 5 years earlier, her answer was short and clear: not voluntarily. That's a telling detail people tend to skip over, because it suggests this wasn't a woman suddenly deciding to open up at the end of her life out of some late career freedom. It was a woman who had made a calculated decision decades earlier to stay private for as long as her career and her ambitions required it, and who was only willing to loosen that grip slightly in exactly the words she chose: once there was very little career left to protect. What she wanted people to understand before she died. Nancy Kulp died of cancer on February 3, 1991, at her home in Palm Desert, California, at 69 years old, just 2 years after that interview was published. The illness had reportedly been diagnosed a couple of years earlier, not long after she'd relocated to the desert community, and it spread aggressively in her final year, moving quickly enough that she had little time to plan any kind of extended farewell tour or reflective press circuit, the way some aging stars manage to arrange. In the time she had left, she didn't spend it clarifying or walking back what she'd said. She kept working, teaching acting as an artist in residence at Juniata College in central Pennsylvania, mentoring younger students in exactly the discipline that had carried her from a small Pennsylvania town into a decades-long career, and by most accounts made peace with the parts of her career people remembered her for, even the ones that had clearly been shaped by things she couldn't say out loud for most of her life. Her former co-star, Buddy Ebsen, would go on to outlive her by more than a decade, passing away in 2003 at 95. Meaning whatever unresolved tension existed between the two of them was left almost entirely one-sided, since only his side of that relationship got the chance to keep evolving in public after her death. Hadley Hall's own book drew its share of controversy too, since some of the actresses he approached, and even a few who were ultimately included, later expressed discomfort at having their private lives discussed at all, regardless of how carefully worded their actual answers were, a reminder that Kulp's cooperation with the project was itself unusually rare among her peers. In the years since her death, LGBTQ advocacy publications have specifically singled her out in retrospectives celebrating overlooked trailblazers, crediting her not with a dramatic public coming out, but with something quieter, being one of relatively few mainstream television actresses of her generation to leave behind any acknowledgement at all, however guarded, rather than taking the full truth to her grave in complete silence. Even now, decades later, her story keeps resurfacing in new documentaries and retrospectives, revisiting both this interview and her long-running tension with Ebsen, a sign that fans and historians alike still find her particular kind of guarded honesty more interesting than most straightforward tell-all confessions from the same era. What makes her final interview genuinely significant isn't a single shocking confession, because she never technically gave one. It's the fact that a woman who spent nearly 40 years in an industry that would have ended her career over the truth chose, right near the end, to leave behind an answer clear enough for people to understand anyway, without ever handing anyone a headline they could use against her. That's a different kind of bravery than a dramatic on-camera confession. Quieter, more careful, but every bit as deliberate. Decades later, historians and fans still point to that 1989 interview as one of the earliest coded acknowledgments from a mainstream television actress of her generation. And it's exactly the kind of small, careful moment that gets rediscovered and re-examined every few years by people who watched her play Miss Jane Hathaway and never once considered what she might have been hiding behind that character the entire time. So knowing what she risked just by answering that one question the way she did, do you think Nancy Kulp gave people the truth, or just enough of it to finally stop being asked? If you enjoyed this unveil, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.